money, jewels, something to make our life better. Here we are as poor farmers. Maybe inside this jar is the solution to all our problems. So what they did is they finally broke it open. And when they did, they were profoundly disappointed. Because in this jar was not gold or jewels or silver. In this jar were just books, just writings. 13 books, in fact, 13 leather codices, inside of which were about 52
jewels, something
individual
to make our life better. Here we are as poor farmers.
And Muhammad
Maybe
Ali,
inside this
not
jar
knowing what
is
he had
the
found,
solution to
took
all
these
our
writings
problems.
and sold them to some local
So what they
antiquities
did is they
dealer,
finally
hardly
broke it
anything at
open.
all,
And when they
and
did,
didn't realize at the
they
time
were
that what he had
profoundly
sold him
disappointed.
later became
Because
known
in this
as
jar
the
was not
Gnostic
gold or
Gospels.
jewels or silver.
In this
This
jar
particular
were archaeological discovery actually contained an entire collection of books about Jesus, books about Christianity, books about how to be a believer, how to be a Christian. But here's what he didn't know, is that these were books that aren't in our Bibles. These are books that at that time many people had never even heard of, and some of which had never even been read in the modern era. And he didn't realize at the time that he had discovered a lost collection of books about Christ from a completely different theological group than the group that we would now recognize as Christianity. And at the center of that collection, probably the most notable book in the whole bunch, is one that's become famous ever since, known as the Gospel of Thomas. Some of you, I imagine, have probably read the Gospel of Thomas or heard about the Gospel of Thomas. Muhammad Ali never had a chance to read the Gospel of Thomas, but if he had read it, he would have realized, oh, this is about Jesus. It sounds a little bit like a gospel. But then you realize that this particular gospel sounds a lot different than the Gospels we have in our Bibles, because this talks about how not so much Jesus is divine, but how you and I can be divine. And the Gospel of Thomas doesn't talk so much about how there's a problem inside you called sin, but rather the Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas says the real problem isn't so much sin, but just lack of enlightenment, lack of knowledge. And so the Gospel of Thomas actually turns out to be a radically different version of Christianity. Now, you may not realize it, but since 1945, when Muhammad Ali made this discovery, it's radically changed the world of gospel studies and the world of biblical studies, because now people are beginning to ask the question that's probably in your mind tonight, which is in everybody's mind when we talk about the Gospel of Thomas, is, well, why isn't the Gospel of Thomas in our Bibles? Why, for that matter, why do we have the books in our Bibles that we have? Why do we have, in our New Testaments, for example, 27 books? You ever wondered this, by the way? Why not 28? Why not 26? Those seem like just as good a numbers as 27. And what makes these books so special, and what makes them different than something like the Gospel of Thomas? And who ever put this together anyway? And why should I think the actions of putting it together should be normative for the Christian? Okay, all those questions that we all have are very natural, normal questions, and these have to do with what we call the origins of the New Testament canon. Okay, now, just a little definition here of the word canon. Now, when I use the word canon, it's spelled C-A-N-O-N, right? And that's important because it's not the cannon that you light a little fuse and blow a cannonball out, right? That's C-A-N-O-N. And I know this because in my students, when they write papers for me at the seminary, I always misspell canon. I always put two N's in it. And I make a little note, I draw a little cannon in the margin with a little ball coming out of it, and then I put a little X through it. No, not that canon. The word canon, C-A-N-O-N, actually is a reference to a word that just means rule or standard. We use it to refer to what books are in our Bibles, and in our discussions this weekend, what books are in our New Testaments. By the way, some of you may know I have a website that I do a lot of my sort of work on, where I send out things in more bite-sized forms for people to read and learn from, and I'll say more about that later in the weekend, and you can go and look at it. But the name of my website is called Canon Fodder, okay? And obviously it's a pun, but it's only a pun if you spell canon correctly, right? Otherwise you think I'm writing a website about blowing things up, which is not what I'm writing about. But our time together is going to answer this question of why not the Gospel of Thomas? Why do we have the books in our canon that we do? Now, you'll quickly realize that in the history of Christianity, this has been considered a problem. And this is the title of our first session tonight, right? The problem of canon. What do I mean by problem? What I mean is it creates challenges if we can't answer the question of how we know which books should be in our New Testaments. Think about it for a moment. When you're talking to your non-Christian friend and you say, hey, well, the Bible says X, Y, Z. And your friend, if they're a student or a reader on these issues, might actually be able to challenge that and say, well, when you say Bible, what do you mean? Well, I mean these 66 books. Well, okay, and then you might say, and I mean these 27 books in the New Testament. And so That's what I mean. And what if that person said, well, but how do you know those are the right 27 books in the New Testament? You say the New Testament teaches this, but how do you even know what the New Testament is? If you can't justify why those books and not others, then you have no way to even quote the New Testament as a thing. In other words, if you can't answer the question about canon, then we couldn't even have a Bible. And this is because of how unique the Bible's construction is, right? The Bible, as you know well, is not just a normal book where one author sits down and writes it over time and then hands it in and it goes to the printing press and off it goes. The Bible is a collection of a bunch of little books, right? That were written over a long period of time, actually over thousands of years when you look at the Old Testament and the New Testament combined. Probably over 40 different authors wrote these books. So we have to realize that when we talk about something called the Bible or something called the New Testament, we have to have some way to boundary these things off, and that's what this problem of canon is all about. Now, here's the thing that you may not realize, is that since our friend Muhammad Ali made that discovery in 1945, critics of Christianity have spent a lot of time narrowing in right on this one problem, right? It's kind of like when you want to go after an opponent in a wrestling match, you find their weak spot, right? And if you're trying to go after Christianity, you're going to find its weak spot. In fact, some scholars in the past have called the canon question the Achilles heel of Christianity, right? It's that one little thing that looks small, doesn't look like a big deal, but if you hit it, the whole thing comes crumbling down. I always refer to the canon question as sort of that loose thread in your sweater, right? Where it's kind of dangling off and you're like, well, let me get rid of that. And you start pulling it, and then pretty soon you keep pulling it. Pretty soon the whole thing comes unraveled, right? You realize it starts off small, but it could become big if you don't do something to fix it. That's the nature of the canon question. And in this first time together tonight, my goal is simply to help you realize why it's a problem. And I want you to realize that the reason it's a problem is not because of what I've already laid out, but because the problem is being fed by several things going on in the modern world today, in the modern academy. So part of what I want to introduce you to in this first talk is a few things happening that are feeding and creating this problem of canon more acutely. Now, in our little worlds as Christians, and we go to church every Sunday, and you go to this church, probably most of you at least on Sundays, and this is a wonderful little church, you probably don't necessarily come across these things. And on one level, one might wonder, why am I coming here and bothering you with problems, right? Why not, ignorance is bliss. Why do we want to learn about things and what's going on in the academy, and our little lives are nice and tidy? But I think you know the answer to that. The answer to that is, of course, we want to bring the message of Christ outside the walls of this church, right? And I know you want that too. You want to see the gospel spread to your neighbors and to your friends and to your coworkers and family members. And what if they don't believe? Right? What if they have questions? We want to have some understanding of what's going on out there in the world. Okay, so let me just mention in this first talk 3 factors that are going on in the modern study of canon today that are feeding the problem. I want you to think of these factors like tributaries in a river, okay? So you got this big river, but why is it so big? Answer, because there's these 3 tributaries that are feeding it, okay? And as they're feeding it, the river's getting bigger, and we as Christians have got to solve this problem of canon. And of course, in the other 3 talks tonight and tomorrow, I'm going to try to actually begin the solving part. Now I'm just laying out the problem part. This is one of those moments where you're glad there's not just one talk, right? What if there was like, okay, here's the problem of canon, let's pray, we'll see you next time. You're like, well, that didn't help much. Well, no, that's not what we're going to do. I'm going to talk about the problem, and then we're going to go back and try to solve it. Okay, so what are these 3 things that are tributaries feeding this problem of canon and making questions like the Gospel of Thomas and Muhammad Ali's discovery so acute in our modern day? 3 factors. Let me mention the first one. There continue to be doubts about the authorship of New Testament books. There continue to be doubts out there about the authorship of New Testament books. Now, when I say there's doubts, I don't mean there's doubts in here. Christians, as we'll see, have answered these questions for generations. But no doubt it's also true that modern scholars continue to poke at the problem of whether the New Testament was really written by the people you think it was written by. And this has to do with this idea of writings that have been faked or forged in the names of other people. Now, again, in our world, this doesn't come up very often, but if you have a child that goes off to a public university, or if you remember back in your days when you were at college and maybe you didn't go to a Christian school and you took a religion class, you would have heard exactly these sorts of things. Some of you may know my story. I just wrote a book a couple years ago called Surviving Religion 101. And it was a book of compilation of letters to my daughter Emma as she was a UNC Chapel Hill student. And the whole idea of the book was to help her stay a Christian in college, help her to deal with the challenges that she'll face. As a side note, my daughter Emma now is a senior, and she is getting ready to graduate, and she's had a really wonderful and positive college experience. But in the middle of her college experience, she ran into a lot of the same challenges I ran into in my college experience. And in the opening of that book, Surviving Religion 101, I tell what happened to me. I was at UNC Chapel Hill as a freshman, a long time ago, won't tell you when. And when I was there, I found myself in a religion class. And it very quickly became apparent that the religion professor was very much lecturing with an eye towards evangelicals. You could tell he was talking, almost like he was talking to people who professed Christian faith. And it became pretty clear after a while that he could relate to us. And he said, you know, I used to be like you. I used to believe what you believed. And then I discovered that he went to Moody Bible Institute. And then I realized he graduated from Wheaton College. And then I realized that he grew up in an evangelical youth group and at one point professed faith in Christ. And that he was lecturing with an eye towards us because he understood us. But then he said, oh, and then I went and got my PhD and I realized all that I believed was wrong. And none of it was true. And he told his story about what changed his mind. What changed his mind is he began to realize that the New Testament was filled with forgeries. Books that were not written by the people that we think they're written by. Now, there I was as a freshman in this religion class thinking to myself, what is happening? Right? Here I am as a Christian. I got to be able to deal with that. I got to be able to answer that. If you don't know, that professor's name was Bart Ehrman, which, if you know who that is, he is one of the most widely published critics of Christianity today, now written well over 30 books, and is probably one of the most famous critics of the Christian faith. Now, when I had him as a student, he wasn't yet famous, right? And I didn't know who he was going to be. I just knew that he didn't like Christianity and was attacking it all the time. And one of his major attacks was this exact first issue, which is, were these books really written by the names attached to them? In fact, Ehrman just came out, and this was more recently, with a whole book on this. Here's the title of his book: Forged, Writing in the Name of God, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. It's a pretty good title, I must say. One thing I've learned over the years is that if you write a book critiquing Christianity, you sell a lot more copies. I know this because I write books not critiquing Christianity, and those don't sell all that many copies. But I often thought, well, maybe I should just write a book critiquing Christianity and then make a lot of money and then later say, I didn't mean it. That was just a big, ruse. But Ehrman has written many books critiquing Christianity, and this one sold a lot of copies. What does he argue in the book? He argues in the book that most of the New Testament was written by people that we don't even know who they are. There's probably about 7 letters of Paul that are really from Paul, and the rest of Paul's letters, 6 others, are from forgers. Peter didn't write 1 Peter, Peter didn't write 2 Peter, James didn't write James, John didn't write John, Matthew didn't write Matthew, Mark and Luke are made-up names. And basically, about 20 of the books in the New Testament are either written by who knows who, or certainly not the names attached to them. Now, you can see how that feeds the problem of canon, right? I'll say more about this tomorrow, but why do you think a certain book belongs in the canon? One of the reasons you think it belongs in the canon, or at least you should think this, is because it was written by someone who has the authority to speak for God, right? Not everybody has the authority to speak for God, right? I don't have the authority to speak for God, not like the New Testament writers did. Pastors speak with a level of authority, but not with the same authority as Paul. Why do we think that the New Testament books are the right books? Well, because they go back to apostles, okay? But what if you found out they weren't written by apostles? What if you found out they were written by someone lying and pretending to be an apostle who wasn't? I bet you'd have quick doubts about whether that was a book that should be in the canon. So according to Ehrman then, we shouldn't have 27 books in our canon. We should probably have about 8. And of course, even those he doesn't think really are inspired. And you can see how the canon question then is fed by this first tributary, right? Doubts about these authors. Now, we're not going to have time this whole weekend to rebut each of these individual claims, right? I'm sort of bringing up these problems. We don't have time to solve all of them. I spent a lot of time in my classes at the seminary rebutting a lot of Ehrman's arguments. I can tell you this, that many of the claims that we don't know who wrote these books, I think, are made on very poor arguments, often relying on stylistic arguments that I find very unpersuasive. And this idea that you can tell who an author might be or couldn't be based on stylistic differences and changes. I look back at some of the stuff I wrote, I'm like, you wouldn't know that was me I could write two different things in a span of a week, and they would look very, very different depending on the audience and my mood and what I was trying to accomplish. There's all kinds of problems with the stylistic arguments. One other thing we've learned too since the beginning of these discussions is that a lot of the New Testament books were written with the help of scribes that would write for you, okay? And we think there's probably a reason that those would have affected the style and the flow of books. In fact, many of Paul's letters, he actually names his scribes. Peter names his scribe Silvanus in 1 Peter. It's interesting how we know that they wrote with scribes. In the ancient world, when you wrote a book, it was very, very rare that you would have held the pen in your hand and written it. Extremely rare. Even if you were educated, even if you were fully literate, the people who would write would often write through what would be called an amanuensis, a secretary, a scribe, someone who would write it down on their behalf. Even Paul, who was very educated, used one of these. And we would expect that those scribes would have had some impact on stylistic issues. Okay, so that's the first tributary. Let me mention a second tributary that you should know about that's continued to feed this problem of canon, and that is the discovery of more apocryphal books, more books outside our New Testaments. And here's where I want to define the word apocryphal. I've already defined the word canonical as the books in our Bibles, right? The word apocryphal is a book we use to refer to books outside our Bibles that kind of look like the books in our Bibles but never made it in, okay? So by the way, there's lots of books outside our Bibles, right? You don't need me to tell you that. We're talking about ancient books, though, that look a little bit like the books in our Bibles but didn't make it in, like the Gospel of Thomas, okay? That would be considered an apocryphal book. The word apocryphal just simply means hidden, okay? It's also the word we use to refer to the books that Roman Catholics have in their Old Testament. That's the term, the Apocrypha, is used from time to time to refer to that. But we're using the term here just simply to refer to these other books like the Gospel of Thomas. Here's what you may not know. In the last 100 years, roughly 120, most of the so-called lost books of the Bible out there have been discovered and uncovered in the last 120 years. There was a few before that, and we knew about many from patristic sources. Church fathers would actually talk about books, but we didn't actually have copies of them. You may not realize this, too, that the Gospel of Thomas was known to the early church. Did you know that? Irenaeus mentions it, and he mentions it negatively, and he condemns it. But we never had a copy. What's happened in the last 150 years then is that we have begun to find in the sands, mostly in Egypt, copies of so-called lost gospels and other kinds of writings. I don't presume for a moment that you took the time to read this overly long biography here in your little bulletin, and please don't bother reading it now, but I did my own PhD work under Larry Hurtado at the University of Edinburgh on an apocryphal gospel, a lost gospel. And it was discovered in a place also in Egypt. Remember our friend Muhammad Ali? He was in a place called Nag Hammadi, Egypt. The place that my little manuscript was found is even in a bigger archaeological site in Egypt called Oxyrhynchus. Now, here's the fun thing about a weekend like this. You're going to learn new terms, right? You've already learned a number of them. Now I'm going to give you the biggest one of all, Oxyrhynchus, okay? And Adam, we should have thought this through. I should have like some award for someone who can spell it rightly without looking, okay? Because it's a really hard word to spell, and you can Google on your phone. That's cheating. But Oxyrhynchus is a reference to a town in Egypt that thrived in the 4th and 5th centuries. It was a big, huge metropolis, big Christian population. So here's what I want you to realize about Oxyrhynchus that's so fascinating. In the late 1800s, around 1890-ish, two scholars from Oxford by the name of Grenfell and Hunt went into Egypt to find the lost city of Oxyrhynchus. This is like Indiana Jones kind of stuff, right? They're there to find the lost city of Oxyrhynchus. Why? Because it was a thriving Christian metropolis and Jewish metropolis and a bunch of pagans living in it too during the time in the ancient world. They figured if they could find the city, it'd be a great location to find ancient manuscripts. Why? Because in Egypt, it's so dry that manuscripts are often preserved very well. So they actually ended up finding in the late 1890s the lost city of Oxyrhynchus. And here's the thing that's amazing. Not only did they find the lost city of Oxyrhynchus, they actually found the garbage dump where everybody threw out all their old manuscripts in the ancient world. And it was like striking gold, not literally, but if you're looking for manuscripts, this is the place to go. And there's so many piled on top of each other that there's like a big pile of them. You could walk up to the wall and pull a manuscript out of the wall. This archaeological dig at Oxyrhynchus is still going on today. It's been going on for 130 years. Same dig. That's how many manuscripts there are. They're still cataloging, they're still editing them, they're still producing them, they're still finding them. Unbelievable. In fact, every year or two, they come out with a new volume of what's called the Oxyrhynchus Papyri. And if you want to be sort of a biblical scholar nerd like me, you can go and look at the Oxyrhynchus Papyri and find out what the new discoveries are. And almost every year, they find new Bible manuscripts. Old Testament, New Testament, Christian writings, non-Christian writings, it's a whole mix. It's a fascinating little world. But here's what I want you to realize about this. In that archaeological discovery, the very first manuscript they pulled out of the wall, called P. Oxyrhynchus I, was a copy of the Gospel of Thomas. Now what's interesting is that no one knew it was the Gospel of Thomas because it was so fragmentary. And it wasn't until about 60 years later that our little buddy Muhammad Ali found the full Gospel of Thomas, and we realized, oh, that little manuscript we found 60 years ago was actually a little fragment of the Gospel of Thomas. And this was begun what was sort of this flood of lost Gospels. So we have now the Gospel of Thomas. We have the one that I did my work on, Oxyrhynchus. Doesn't have a name. It's just the number, Oxyrhynchus 840. There's also known the Gospel of Peter. There's the Gospel of Philip. There's the Gospel of Mary. There's the Gospel of Truth. There's the Gospel of the 12. You could see the impetus behind that gospel, which is, I've got a gospel written by all 12 disciples, right? Not just one of them. And on it goes. We have many, many of these lost gospels. Now, so many do we have that people have written a lot of books about these. And they always have the term lost or forgotten in the title. This is fascinating. Lost Christianities, lost gospels, forgotten scriptures. I have all these on my shelves in my office, and it's fascinating. You can go read about these. Those documents really exist. And here's what I want you to realize. This is the other tributary feeding the canon question. Every time they find one of these books, doesn't it make you wonder, why do we have the books we have? How do we know that we have the right books? Now, little side note here, just to reassure you on each of these points, is that, and I have other lectures where I get into this, each one of these so-called lost gospels that we've discovered in places like Oxyrhynchus, and we found them in other places too, all of them have been dated to the 2nd century or later. Why does that matter? Because that means that none of them could have actually been written by an apostle. Okay? None of them go back to the 1st century. None of them go back to an eyewitness. None of them go back to a real follower of Jesus. In other words, all of them are written late, and all of them, at some level, are fabrications or forgeries, although we think some of them may record some true things that might have possibly happened. Now, people ask me all the time, are you saying then that the Gospel of Thomas wasn't written by Thomas, one of the 12? That's exactly what I'm saying. Of course it wasn't written by Thomas. It was written in the 2nd century or later. And then people ask next, well, then why call it the Gospel of Thomas? Well, I say, well, if you're trying to write a gospel in the 2nd century and you wanted to give it a hearing, what would you call it? You wouldn't call it Bob's Gospel, right? You're going to try to call it something that gets people's attention and sounds apostolic, which is exactly what we see these lost gospels doing. Now, a few years ago, they actually found, in quotes, what's called the lost gospel of Jesus' wife. Now, some of you may have heard of this, the gospel of Jesus' wife. I actually wrote a little bit of this on my website when it came out. This is 2012-ish, where they found a little fragment of papyrus that was dated 4th, 5th century that was written in Coptic that told the story of Jesus' wife and that Jesus now was married. You think that got the media's attention? Oh my, did it. And it was all over the newspapers, all over the internet, all over everything. And then it turns out that so-called lost gospel of Jesus' wife was a modern forgery. It wasn't an ancient forgery, we have plenty of those, but a modern forgery. Turns out they traced it back to some guy in Florida who actually faked it and ended up fooling some of the very finest paleographers and papyrologists in the world. And you're like, wow, that's crazy. In fact, so interesting is it that the guy who broke the story was a writer for The Atlantic, not a Christian, called Ariel Sabar, who ended up uncovering that this was a forgery and then wrote a whole book on it. It's about that thick. And the name of the book's called Veritas. If you want a fascinating read That's a crazy story. It's like something you could not make it up. But it really happened. It tells you that these lost gospels, the non-Christian world wants them to be true. Why? Because if you can pick your own gospel, then you can pick your own Jesus, okay? And you can pick the Jesus you really prefer. And that actually leads us to the third and final tributary I want to talk about in our first talk today. And that is the role of diversity in early Christian studies. And let me explain what I'm talking about. So the first tributary was debate over authors, okay? Second tributary that's feeding this issue of canon is the discovery of apocryphal books. The third issue that's fed the issue of canon is the modern scholarly fascination with diversity. And let me explain what I mean by this. When I use the term diversity in this context, I'm not talking about ethnic diversity or racial diversity. I'm talking about the modern scholarly fascination with the diversity of ideas. Okay. What do I mean? What I mean is, and if you've been in any academic spaces, you know this, our world sort of can't get enough of pointing out that in academic spaces and philosophies and religions, there's all these different views, all these different ideas, all these different approaches. There's a great diversity of opinions about everything. Opinions about God, about Jesus, about heaven, about hell, about how you're saved, how you're not saved, about right and wrong, good and evil, moral, immoral. The world is filled with the diversity of ideas about all these things. And by the way, that's true. You have to live very long or pay much attention to know that if you were to walk into a city or on a college campus or read a few books, you realize everyone's got an opinion on everything. However, here's what happens in our culture. Our culture is not just simply observing the existence of diversity. That's not disputable. We can all observe that. Have you ever noticed that our culture observes the existence of a diversity of ideas and then draws a conclusion from it? I want you to notice this. It's that second step that's key. They draw a conclusion from the existence of diversity. It's that second step they subtly slip in without you knowing it. You don't even realize it's been made. What's that conclusion they draw from it? Because there's so many different opinions out there, then no one view can be right. Then no one view can be right. It's that second move, that second step, okay, that is slipped into the diversity discussion. Now, if that's happening in our world today, all around us, and you know it is, it's also happening in the world of modern scholarship, particularly as it pertains to canon. And this brings us to a person by the name of Walter Bauer. Now, you don't have any reason I know to know who Walter Bauer is, but Walter Bauer wrote a very famous book in the early 20th century called Heresy and Orthodoxy in Earliest Christianity. And here's the essence of Bauer's argument. Bauer basically argues that in the earliest Christian movement, there was no such thing as Christianity. Just let this sink in. In fact, instead, what does Bauer argues? He argues that in the earliest Christian movement, there wasn't Christianity, there was Christianities, plural. In other words, he argues there wasn't any one version of Christianity, there was a bunch of versions of Christianity. There was diversity. Everybody had an idea about who Jesus was. Everybody had an idea about what Jesus did and what Jesus said. And there's all these different Christian groups and Christian sects all trying to figure out who was the original and who's the most authentic and who's right. And everyone's fighting it out for the claim to be the original version of Christianity. And what does Bauer argue? And this is the big payoff. Each of these little groups that claim to be the real Christianity each have their own books. And they each have their own canons. Why do you have the books in your Bible that you read today? Because that one group that you now call Christianity happened to win the theological wars, so to speak, and that became dominant, and because it became dominant, then now you read a 27-book canon that includes the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But, says Bauer, what if another group had won? What if the Gnostics had won? Well, you wouldn't be reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You'd be reading the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary. What does that all mean? What that all means is that according to this third tributary, canon is merely the accident of history. It's just because one group won and decided it. But why would you think it matters what they decide? Why should I care what they decide? What if another group had won? And this is what I want, and I'm building up to my second talk tonight with this, and this is important for you to grasp. This is the water of postmodernity that modern scholars are swimming in when it comes to canon. And they figure that if they can just show there's a lot of disagreement out there about canon, then no one canon can be right, all of them are equally right, or all of them are equally wrong, and that books have no more merit than another book. It's just that one book's got in because of the accident of history, and one got left out because of the accident of history. No books are better than any others. Now, this is really fed the Canon question. Okay, so now everybody's like, yeah, why should I care what books are in or out? And whoever put books in or out is just some smoke-filled room committee somewhere who voted and decided these are the books they're going to be because we happen to like them. Now, in my second talk, I'm going to completely dismantle the idea that books were picked in the 4th century in some smoke-filled room, okay? We'll get there when we get there. What I want you to notice right now, though, is that fascination with the diversity of ideas is feeding this problem, and we have to come up with a way to address it and solve it. Okay, so let me recap here. This first talk is designed simply to introduce you to the problem of canon. The story of Muhammad Ali's discovery sort of helps you realize why do we care about this, because we want to know why these books and not others. And then scholars are feeding the issue with these 3 tributaries, right? Doubts about whether the books are really written by who we think, more and more discoveries of apocryphal books, these lost books out there that are continuing to be found. And by the way, they'll find more, trust me. I don't know if they'll be genuine or not, but they'll find more. And then thirdly, this fascination with diversity in the study of early Christianity. Okay, one of the things I think we built in here, Adam, you can help me, is you want to do a short Q&A after each session? Is that how you want to do it? Yeah? Okay. So this room may be small enough not to need the mic, but I'm going to let you guys figure that out for the recording. Okay. And I'll try to repeat the questions either way. But yeah, so here's an opportunity for you to ask questions, make comments about this first session, and let me encourage you to do it. I love Q&A time. I think it's the most fun, actually. I tell some churches, I'll just come do Q&A. How about that? No talk. Just go straight to Q&A. I think that's always the most interesting time, regardless. So if you have a question, just put your hand up, say it, and then I'll repeat it for the recording, and then we'll go ahead and start going down that path. Yes. Yep, that's you. That's a great, very interesting question. So the question, if you didn't hear it, was, is it really just a Christian phenomenon of forging books, or do other religions have the same problem? That's a very interesting question, and I think there's a number of different layers to answer it. First of all, it's not a distinctively Christian problem. In the ancient world, people forged books all the time, okay? And we know this in secular spaces, right? So, for example, one of the earliest sort of medical doctors or philosophers by the name of Galen, Galen, 2nd century scientist of sorts, was mad that people were forging books in his name. Okay, so the idea that it's a Christian phenomenon is not. It's a literary phenomenon throughout the ancient world. But in terms of other religions, that's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if that's true for sort of, you have to realize that there's not that many religions that base themselves on books, right? So that's distinctively a Jewish, Christian, and Islamic phenomenon. And unless you want to throw in something like the Book of Mormon here with Joseph Smith, which is sort of a Christian heresy, right? Then I don't know what really to say about other religions. Now, the Book of Mormon phenomenon is a forged book, right? Despite the claim that the angel Moroni dropped it from heaven on gold tablets. We don't have it. It's got all kinds of manuscript problems. So I think it's clear that forgeries extend well beyond the Christian world in some ways, although I don't know all the different ways that might happen in the religious spheres. It's a very interesting question. Other questions about some of these preliminary issues? Yep.
With us, the postmodern era is relatively new, but through the course of history, is there a pattern? Is this really new, or has it showed itself in the past?
Well, it depends what part of the postmodern era you're referring to. Are you referring to this idea of sort of the existence of diversity means there's no one right view? Yeah, that's not as new as people think it is. It's new to us because we have lived and enjoyed a Western culture founded largely on Christian principles. But once you get outside of the Western culture largely founded on Christian principles, that's not a new phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that's been in Eastern religions for generations. But it's certainly new in our space, right? So when we talk about post-modernity, obviously that's after modernity, which itself is a Western phenomenon, right? Sort of science gives you all the answers type of thing. So modernity thinks you can find truth, probably a little overconfident. Post-modernity is like there is no truth. It's vastly oversimplified. But if you go to Eastern religions like Buddhism and so forth, that's not new. So it's just new to us. By the way, I'm not saying therefore it's not a problem. I think it's a big problem, but it's just not new historically, if I could say it that way. Yes.
pronounce it again?
Oxyrhynchus, yes.
Oxyrhynchus.
Yes.
This is your world.
Yeah.
What would you secretly hope they actually find it?
It's a great question. So for the recording and for if you didn't hear it, the question is, if you could create your own discovery at Oxyrhynchus, not forged, obviously, but if you could come up with an idea of what would be the perfect discovery, what would it be? Well, I suppose most people in our spaces would probably say, wouldn't it be great if we could find copies of the New Testament from the first century, right? What if we found a first century version of one of our 27 books? That would be pretty nice. I don't think that'll ever happen, but it would be a very nice wish list. By the way, we do have second century copies of manuscripts from the New Testament, which is just crazy early as it is. But to have a first century would be, the ink would hardly be dry by the time, you read the thing or got the copy made. And that would be stunning. You may have heard the news over the last few years of a so-called first century Mark that had made a first century gospel Mark that had kind of made the rounds in the media. It turns out it wasn't first century, but I think that was driven by this desire to have first century manuscripts. So I suppose that would be pretty cool to have. I don't think it would change anything, you have to realize. My beliefs would stay pretty much exactly the same, but it'd be fun to have. So, yeah, Adam?
You say first century, or if we've got second century, how are they doing this? Like carbon dating? Like what is giving them confidence that it is a specific century?
Yeah, so manuscripts are dated in lots of ways, and it's a larger discussion, but for our purposes here, the most common way we get down to narrow dates are from handwriting. So it's paleography. Okay, so if you're doing a paleographical analysis of a manuscript, you're studying the particular scribal hand, it's called a scribal hand, and how that hand fits within the dating of scribal hands from what we know from the larger swath of manuscripts. It's extremely difficult to do and very imprecise. So you can get generalities, but the problem is handwriting styles don't suddenly stop after 50 years and then everyone decides, oh, let's change handwriting styles, right? We can see general trends, but it gets tricky. So that's the way we do it, which, you can get the sense that, wow, that's not very tight, and I wish it were tighter. I saw a hand back here. Maury, yep.
The Gospel of Thomas was by Muhammad Ali, found in one port, one place, but
Mhm.
then portions of Gospel of Thomas were found somewhere else.
Yep.
Give just a 1-minute explanation for maybe folks in the room who we don't actually have the original authorship of any of the Gospels. Maybe you're going to get that bit later.
Mhm.
What does it mean to make copies?
Yeah. Yeah, so in the ancient world, if you wrote a book in the ancient world, obviously that book was written by hand, right? You didn't sit down on your laptop and write it in the ancient world. And then if you wanted to quote unquote publish that book, it had to be sent into distribution. And the way that was done is that copies were made. So scribes would make copies of the book, and then copies would be made of the copies, and copies would be made of the copies, and the book would spread throughout the ancient world. By the way, every ancient text does that and operates that way. That's not just a Christian issue. That's everyone in the ancient world has to deal with that. So whenever you have an historical account, a written document, usually you have a copy of it. You don't have the original that the author actually wrote. So when Paul wrote Romans and actually wrote the first version of Romans, we don't have that. And hardly any document in antiquity do we actually have what are called the autographs, the original versions of. Now, before that throws you into any kind of panic, it shouldn't, because that doesn't keep us from knowing what the text said, because we have so many copies of the New Testament, and that's not really our discussion this weekend, because that's more about textual transmission, not canon. But we have so many copies of our manuscripts that we can compare them and contrast them and see if and how they change, and be very confident about the original wording. So, and so that's true in the Gospel of Thomas too. So here's what's interesting, you may not know this, is we have so many thousands of copies of our New Testament, more than really almost any other ancient text. Just in our Gospels alone, we probably have north of 2,500 copies of our Gospels in terms of manuscript copies. The Gospel of Thomas, we have a grand total of 3, okay, just to put it in perspective. And by the way, we're only talking about copies in Greek, because that's the original language for both of them, right? So if we want to talk about copies of the New Testament outside of Greek, the numbers go astronomically higher, because now we're talking about Latin and Coptic and Syriac and Armenian and Ethiopic and so on. So yeah, it gets totally better. But if you just stick with Greek, we still outpace everybody. By the way, all 3 copies of the Gospel of Thomas in Greek were found at Oxyrhynchus. P-Oxy 1, and then these numbers don't mean anything to you, 654 and 655 were the 3 Thomas copies, and they're all very fragmentary and very limited. We didn't know what they were until our buddy Muhammad Ali in 1945 found the full version of it in Coptic. Yes?
So a lot of scrolls or writings have been found in Egypt, and part of that was prescribed.
Yep.
They've been preserved well. So what would be the span of like regions that Canon or scrolls people have thought might be attributed to Canon? Where has that all been found? Like, do you think it's ancient?
Yeah, so almost all our manuscripts are the ancient Near East as we know it. So it would be obviously Egypt would be a large part of that. Up into Palestine or Israel, we found a good number. So for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in Palestine on the shore of the Dead Sea in one of the many caves on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. By the way, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I always tell my students this and they think I'm making it up. Literally, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found by a shepherd looking for lost sheep. Just let that sink in. He was looking for lost sheep in hiding potentially in the caves of the Dead Sea because that's where you get shade in the hot summer. And the shepherd was throwing stones in there to try to rustle them out, and he heard pottery break and went in to investigate. So, but we have them all within that range. Now, later manuscripts we have in lots of places. Okay, so once you start going Middle Ages, we got them in Europe, we got them in England, we've got them all over the place. But ancient, we're talking pre-5th century, we're almost all in the A&E belt. Yes?
Old Testament, the selling, the Canon Old Testament, they had the same problem. We talk about New Testament, but how would you contrast similar and different?
Well, they're similar in some ways, but it's its own story. And, I'll come back some other weekend and do Old Testament canon if you want. The short version is that there's good evidence for thinking that when Jesus began his ministry in the 1st century, that the Old Testament canon was pretty much established and settled, okay? And so really for Christians, the only thing we have to think about going forward is, well, how did the New Testament come to be? Because Jesus affirmed the Old Testament structure, as did the apostles, by quoting it, by affirming it, and by talking about it. That doesn't mean they listed out all 66 books, of course, but it does give us the seeds we need to do to put that together. Okay, I think we have time for one more before our break. One more question before we close this out. I saw a hand over here. No? Good. Adam, instructions on the break? You want me to make up some instructions? 15 minutes, lots of charcuterie. We're back here, I guess.